Hey homeschoolers! Today we're going over some awesome resources to use for learning about the American history time period of the Civil Rights Movement. Also, this is a collaboration hosted by Leilani from Living with Eve, and we are each tackling a different time in history and giving you an awesome guide to resources to use. The collaboration playlist will be linked down below in the description box of this video, so be sure to check out the other videos after watching mine. And if you are new here, please introduce yourself in the comments. I would love to say hello. Now, this is a very educational video, so I am planning to talk briefly on everything. Please keep in mind anything I can find a link for will be linked down below this video in the drop box. And also, keep in mind, my approach to history is not to sugarcoat. I may not show my children visuals of the bad side of the civil rights movement or go in depth on the fine details of horrifying situations like lynchings of African Americans, but I do not hide those topics either. So in these recommendations, you may find hard topics to address and you can choose how to deal with those topics as you please. But as for how we handle it, we discuss those hard topics. We offer emotional support for our children as we explore those hard topics. Also, I tried to find ways around the same civil rights people. It is not hard to find good resources on things like Martin Luther King Jr. So I didn't include too much about him or other popular topics in this video. I wanted to bring light to people we don't always hear about when it comes to the civil rights movement. First, before books, let's go ahead and discuss some movies that could be wonderful to use for teaching about the civil rights movement. The first movie I would like to recommend is the American Girl story Melody 1963 Love Has to Win. It is a long title and an unusual movie to think of regarding history, but I think the movie did a great job at approaching the civil rights movement from a child perspective. And it's a story about a young girl who is starting to see the wrong being done to African Americans, and the parents struggle between how much to shelter her from seeing versus exposing her to all the bad things happening to African Americans fighting for equal rights during this period. Melody, the main character, has many questions and discussions around the right and wrongs of equality during the mid-1900s. Throughout the entire movie, they hash out the answers to her questions. And this is one of my daughter's favorites, actually, and it keeps her interested the whole time. The next movie I would like to recommend is Ruby Bridges. This is an older film from the 90s, and unfortunately, I have yet to see anyone recreate a movie about her. I feel there should honestly be another version, like an updated version personally, but I don't know of one. So if you know of one, please let me know in the comments below so I can check it out. So Ruby Bridges is a real person who in the 1960s was a very brave little girl and attended a new school that was previously segregated. She faced a lot of adversity that is quite eye-opening and hard to watch. And as a mom, I struggled to learn about children going through so much adversity. It's just a struggle for me, and it may make you cry. It made me cry. But I highly recommend this movie, and I will say I wasn't the biggest fan of the scripting for white characters in this movie, but I also keep in mind that this is a movie from a few decades ago, and also it was written with language used to an even older time period, the 50s and 60s. So just keep that in mind, that the verbiage is, a little dated. Other than that, I still highly recommend it. Another great movie to give children an idea of the civil rights is Hidden Figures. Though this movie's main storyline may not focus on the civil rights movement, it is important to get an idea of the other factors at play during this time period. So this movie does touch on some of the scenes from the civil rights protests, but its main priority is to follow three very intelligent women who have a lot of stumbling blocks created by society to overcome. And when I say intelligent, I really mean it. We're talking about genius women who were pioneers in their industry, and they were making room for both women and African Americans in the world of science. The entire movie does address issues that the civil rights movement fought to end, like segregated bathrooms, segregated things like coffee pots, communities, and employment opportunities. So even though its main point is not the movement itself, you will find plenty of ways to tie it into your learning. The last movie is Remember the Titans, and this movie addresses segregation and racial tension that came along with the changes happening at the time. From what I understand, the movie is based on real people. However, it does sacrifice some of the factual parts in the movie for dramatic effect, so do keep that in mind if you want to consider that. Regardless, this movie still shares a great picture of the tension of racism and overcoming segregation and bonding as a mixed race team. An honorable mention for a movie recommendation is Selma. However, This is one that I recommend researching the parental advisory, as it does contain some violence and sexually suggestive moments. So if your kids are older or aware of these topics, I would recommend it, but just keep that in mind when you are looking up this movie for smaller children. Next are read aloud books. The first book is What is the Civil Rights Movement by Sherry Smith. This is a popular book series that goes alongside the Who Was books that a lot of us are familiar with. And this is a great small segment way to read daily about the civil rights movement. It touches on people you don't usually hear about, like Ida B. Wells and her history, uncomfortable topics like the Ku Klux Klan and their atrocities they committed, and things like classism with racism as a factor. Another great read aloud is Child of the Civil Rights Movement by Paula Young Shelton. The author is the niece of the late MLK Jr. and shares a unique perspective of a child who was closely associated with the civil rights movement and all that took place behind scenes to make it happen. And it shares a great perspective for children to see how another child present for the civil rights era processes everything going on around her. She Stood for Freedom is a unique book for a read aloud. I will say this is a book discussing heavy topics like the racially charged bombing of the church in the South that had child casualties. Please keep that in mind, but I recommend this book because though I do believe it is important to keep the focus on the African American people and their stories involved in the movement, there is still reason to include stories of white people involved as well. And that is due to the nature of the civil rights movement. It is very, very, very easy to focus on the division of race. So we should also highlight that there were white people who chose to partner with the civil rights movement, regardless of the consequences. This book is about, let me try my best to say her name, Joan Trumpauer Milholland, a white woman who seen the issues of inequality and wrong done to minorities and was willing to put all of it on the line because she knew it was the right thing to do. Add this to your read aloud list to continue to show different people can unite and the beauty that comes from it. Another book is If You Were a Kid During the Civil Rights Movement by Gwendolyn Hooks. This book shares two perspectives from the civil rights era. One kid who formerly went to a desegregated school who moves to another state where the schools are still segregated, which is where the other child has lived their whole life, plus her twin brothers. You learn some interesting facts about things like the Green Book, which was a must-have travel item for African Americans. And it was a book full of hotels and places that would allow African American clientele. The storyline follows kids and the unfolding of the protests and other events that happen, and the book will touch on things like police violence, bombings, and tension during the marches. Once again, people, this is a hard era to talk about, so just know it's going to have bad stuff to talk about. Now, some of the honorable mentions to check out as well are Voice of Freedom and Malcolm Little. Finally, let's talk about picture books. The first one is Let the Children March by Monica Clark Robinson. And this is a great book to show the power of children and how their voices can be magnified regardless of their young age. This book sheds light on the role of children in marches as their parents couldn't always attend due to work or other factors at play. And I absolutely love books that shine a light on children who make changes in the world. Keep in mind, this book does touch on children being arrested during the civil rights movement, which was a thing that happened. And this is a topic we have discussed in our home, but it may be new to you. So keep that in mind that, you'll have to talk about children being arrested. This next book is one that made me emotional because it touches on the life cycle of humans alongside the changes that have happened for the better. This book is called These Hands by Margaret Mason. And this book is where a grandfather shares the many things that he has done with his hands in his lifetime. And the grandfather is a jack of all trades and he has many talents. But the grandfather also shares what these hands could not do, or what his hands could not do, due to the color of his skin. The grandson then shares that he can do all the things his grandfather did and more thanks to people like his grandfather who have paved the way to a better future for future generations. Very touching book, guys. I'm not kidding. I cried. Books on these topics make me cry a lot. The last book is a good reminder that the simplest act can have a great impact when we are working out of a place of love and we use a skill that we are good at. The book Pies from Nowhere by Dee Romito. This is a story about Georgia Gilmore, a woman who fed and funded the civil rights movement. And Georgia would sell food that she made and use the money to help the civil rights movement. This had to remain a top secret mission for her in order to avoid disruption from supporters of continued inequality of races. And her circle was tight, and she kept a close eye on every part of the operation. And she was later fired from her job after testifying during the boycotts. MLK Jr. encouraged her to start her own business, and that business became very successful. And some other books I recommend but don't have time to speak on are Freedom Summer, Counting on Catherine, A Ride to Remember, and The Case for Loving. Keep in mind, I linked everything I could in the drop box below this video, so click the video on the top here to get a look at the collaboration playlist, and click this bottom link over here to check out new videos of mine.